Welcome to the San Francisco Regional Mensa Monthly Speaker Series. Our speaker today is Joe Devney, my friend and my fellow Culture Quest team member. Joe is a linguist with an MA in linguistics from Georgetown with additional education in forensic linguistics. He has delivered presentations to both specialist and lay audiences in the US and at academic conferences in Portugal, the Netherlands, and China. Often the first question a linguist is asked is, how many languages do you speak? You ever get that, Joe?
Oh, too often, yes.
But actually linguistics is more about how languages work, and ultimately how the mind works. Thus, linguistics intersects with many other disciplines, such as psychology, biology, and sociology. Joe may be a polyglot, but he most certainly is a polymath. And our Culture Quest team, whenever there's a question that's too arcane for the rest of us, we pass it on to Joe and he figures it out. Today, Joe will talk about his specialty, forensic linguistics, which is where law and linguistics meet, and specifically about 3 real-life criminal trials. So please direct all questions to me, and you can see my name is Questions, and you can do that in the chat feature, and then Joe will answer them at the end of his talk. Got that, everyone? So welcome, Joe Devney.
Thank you very much, Roberta, and welcome to everyone else. Thank you for coming out, at least sitting at your computer on a Sunday afternoon. This is my first talk delivered via Zoom, so I apologize in advance for any glitches that I cause. Today, as Roberta said, I'm going to be talking about linguistics in the criminal justice system. I have 3 cases to talk about, and as it happens, they're all murder trials. Now, a couple of them were big news, and you probably read about them, probably remember them. The other one was not big news, at least not where I live, but I know about that one in more detail because I worked on it as an expert witness, and I examined some of the evidence. Now, I did not work on the other 2, and as it happens, no linguists were called in as expert witnesses on either of them. But I still have opinions about those cases, which I'll share with you. So the first trial I'm going to talk about was in the news earlier this year, and the crime itself was in the news for several months before that. Police officer Derek Chauvin was accused of murdering a suspect by the name of George Floyd by suffocating him to death. This one is probably still fairly fresh in everyone's mind. You may remember a particular point of contention between the prosecutor and the defense. There was an audio recording of something George Floyd said while he was under Officer Chauvin's knee. 5 words. What were they? One argument the defense made was that Floyd died because he was under the influence of drugs that inhibited his breathing. The prosecution said that this was not true, and all the blame belongs to Chauvin. So, did Floyd say, "I ate too many drugs," or did he say, "I ain't do no drugs"? This came up during the questioning of one witness, a guy named James Ryerson. First, the defense attorney questioned him. The defense attorney played a 4-second clip from a police body cam, and he asked Ryerson if he heard Floyd say, "I ate too many drugs." Ryerson agreed, that's what he said. And that seems like clear-cut evidence that Floyd was on drugs, possibly overdosing. But then the prosecutor questioned the same witness. And the prosecutor played a much longer clip from body cam. And maybe the evidence isn't as clear-cut as it seemed. Now the witness's testimony, you can see here, I believe Mr. Floyd was saying, I ain't do no drugs. So that's a little different than what you were asked about when you only saw a portion of the video, correct? And Ryerson agrees, yes, sir. So maybe Floyd didn't have any drugs in his system. Now I listened to these exchanges on NPR and I kept thinking, why aren't they bringing in a linguist? There are reasons why people might misinterpret spoken language, and there are techniques for determining what was said. Linguists know about these things. The first thing to talk about is forensic phonetics. I will admit that this is outside of my areas of expertise. I know enough about phonetics to give you this explanation, but I would not be the person you should call in if you need this sort of analysis. But let's go. Phonetics is the study of how the sounds of speech are produced in the vocal tract, all the way from the larynx out through the lips. This is about biology and physics. The air from the lungs goes from the larynx, which may or may not vibrate, and then out the mouth or the nose. The shape of the vocal tract as we move the jaw, lips, and tongue determines exactly what sounds come out. And these sounds have multiple frequencies associated with them. Phoneticians have a software tool called PRAT that would take speech as input and produce a graph of the component frequencies. A phonetician can examine this graph called a spectrogram and tell you what is going on in the vocal tract. So, did Floyd say, I ate or I ain't? The phonetician would review the spectrogram. Here are the spectrograms for me saying these two sentences. The first thing the phonetician would look for is a blank spot near the beginning of the utterance. All the frequencies go silent for a short time, leaving a vertical white bar in the spectrogram. That's the T sound in either word. It happens because when you make the T sound, the tongue blocks off the airflow for a short time, probably tens of milliseconds, not long at all. So the phonetician has located the stop consonant in the spectrogram. Then she looks immediately to the left of it. The nasal sound, the N of the N, has its own characteristic pattern of frequencies. It's there or it isn't. He said ain't or he said ate. None of this is what do you think you hear stuff. And I'm sorry I can't go into more detail on what exactly is revealed in these graphs, in these spectrograms. It's been much too long since I've studied this stuff. But it may be that the recording of Floyd uttering that sentence is of low quality. Maybe the phonetician can't identify individual sounds because there's too much noise. Or maybe the lawyer just wants to cover all bases. Either way, it might be helpful to bring in a linguist who studies dialects. Consider the two sentences. Neither one sounds like standard American English. But standard American English is not the dialect that everyone uses all the time. It's just that the, excuse me, and there's something that not everyone realizes. All dialects are equally consistent and rule bound. It's just that the rules are different. Someone from Appalachia who says might could is not using bad English. He's following the rules of his local dialect, which allows the double modal like that and has rules for when it can be used. Here's a quick illustration from African American vernacular English to show about the rule bound part of that. The formal version of this sentence here is, he is coming. But it's perfectly acceptable in standard American English to use a contraction and say, he's coming. Here's the new rule. In any situation where you can shrink he is down to he's in standard English, you can shrink the is down to nothing in AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. So what did the lawyers need for the benefit of the jury? An expert in George Floyd's dialect. I assume that would be AAVE as it is spoken in the upper Midwest. The dialect expert would be able to say which of the two suggested sentences would be used in Floyd's dialect. Maybe neither of them. So back to my original question. Why didn't either lawyer bring in a linguist instead of simply asking the witness, what do you think he said? You have a much better chance of presenting the truth to the jury if you get the right expertise. Now I want to bring up a side issue here. Whose side would the linguist of either kind be on? Over the winter, I served as a juror on a very long civil trial. The issue was cancer caused by asbestos exposure. Several expert witnesses testified, and I learned through the testimony that all the experts had a side. They always testified on behalf of one side or the other. For example, the witnesses the plaintiff called always testified for people who were suffering from mesothelioma and never for the companies that produced or sold asbestos products. My experience in forensic linguistics is different. Whose side would the linguist of either kind be on? Over the winter, I served as a jury, if a phonetician or a dialectologist were called in to be an expert witness on this case, would it help the prosecution or the defense? We don't know. The evidence is the evidence. It determines, it depends on what the linguist determines, Floyd said. If a lawyer calls me in to review some language evidence and maybe testify about it, I'm not there to support the lawyer's case necessarily. I'm there to give my informed opinion. What I find in the evidence would not change if I were hired by the other side instead. Probably what would happen if I analyzed the language evidence and said, well, this supports the other side's case, the lawyer would just pay me for my time and be done, and they would find some other way to make their case. Here's another case that was widely covered in the news, though it was several years ago. George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin, who was an unarmed teenager. There was a lot of interest in the racial angle here because Zimmerman was white and Martin was black. But I'm going to focus on a specific language issue, one that didn't come out in the trial, but was much discussed in the court of public opinion before the trial. Okay, I'm going to focus on a specific language issue. This is one that didn't come out in the trial, but was much discussed in the court of public opinion before the trial. I'm going to talk about two types of meaning. An utterance, something someone says, has a semantic meaning and a pragmatic meaning, and they're not always the same. Let me give you a quick refresher on the case. Trayvon Martin is the teenager that George Zimmerman killed. He was staying with a relative and had gone out to buy a bag of candy. George Zimmerman was the man who followed Martin and ended up shooting him. Here's a quick rundown of what happened. Zimmerman was sitting in his truck watching what happened in the neighborhood. He saw Martin and thought he looked suspicious. He called the police to report him and then got out of his truck to follow him. So here's the incident broken down into smaller pieces. Now, there was a lot of talk regarding this incident. Today, I'm keeping the focus very narrow. We're going to talk about that third action, when Zimmerman called the police. In fact, just about one sentence in that conversation. Zimmerman called the police non-emergency number to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood. Zimmerman told the police dispatcher, hey, we've had some break-ins in my neighborhood, and there's a real suspicious guy. And then later on, he said, something's wrong with him. Yep, he's coming to check me out. He's got something in his hands. I don't know what his deal is. And here's what the dispatcher told him. We've got someone on the way. And then the dispatcher asks Zimmerman if he's following Martin, and he says, yeah. The dispatcher tells him, okay, we don't need you to do that. And here's what I'm going to focus on today. This one sentence from the dispatcher. Literally, he told Zimmerman that the police didn't need him to follow Martin. The police were already on their way. How would you interpret that sentence? Here's part of a discussion that was on a political blog. Here's someone who thought that Zimmerman did the right thing, quoting some people who think he was in the wrong. He is focusing on that call to the police. He says that the people he is about to quote have no concern for the truth. Saying things like this. He was told by the operator to cease and desist. Zimmerman was explicitly told to stop following. Zimmerman was told not to get out of the car. Zimmerman ignored the police and continued his pursuit. And here are more people pushing back on those arguments. They may be hard to read, so I'm going to read them for you. Here's a sarcastic one. So you don't need to do that is the same as you are hereby ordered by a duly sworn police officer to cease your pursuit. Is that right? Somebody else wrote, correction. Dispatcher said, we don't need you to do that. They never ordered him to stop. It was not an order, it was a suggestion. And this one disparages the dispatcher. First, the police didn't tell him to stop. The 9/11 dispatcher with a high school diploma told him he didn't need to do that. So we've got several people weighing in on the implication of that conversation between Zimmerman and the police dispatcher. Some inaccuracies, some sarcasm. How would a linguist look at the exchange? How do we find meaning? Here's a basic concept. Semantic meaning versus pragmatic meaning. What the words mean versus what the speaker means. They're not always the same. Why not? Why would we say something if we really meant something else? There's several reasons we might do that. We have idioms. If I say it's raining cats and dogs, nobody's going to expect to see carcasses in the street. And if we do it for humorous effect or for reasons of politeness, how can the listener interpret what is meant? Let me introduce some technical terms. Even if you don't remember the terms, I hope you at least retain the concepts. A speech act is an utterance that tries to get something across to the listener and usually to evoke a reaction. Let me give you an example. Suppose you go to lunch with your coworker. The waitress brings him his burger and fries. He sees the bottle of ketchup on your side of the table, and he says, if you could hand me that ketchup, that'd be great. He has performed a locutionary act. He has uttered a sentence that has meaning. The literal meaning of what he said is that he thinks it would be good to live in a world in which it was physically possible for you to hand him the ketchup. He's also performed an illocutionary act. He has told you to give him the ketchup that is on your side of the table. That's the pragmatic meaning. And his utterance has perlocutionary force. The expected response is that you pick up the bottle of ketchup and offer it to him. Now, why did your hypothetical coworker do that? Why didn't he just say, you made the ketchup? Because as coworkers, you're peers or equals. If he gave you a direct order and you followed it, that little exchange will demonstrate that he has the authority to order you around. That would be awkward. So in situations like this, we use polite constructions to avoid things like that. Now, why did the hypothetical you respond that way? Why did you understand what he meant? Here's another bit of technical jargon. The maxims of conversational cooperation. Here's why. A speaker's meaning can be calculated on the basis of semantic meaning, the meaning of the words, and the assumption that speakers are behaving rationally and cooperatively. When we talk to someone, we assume they're attempting to be cooperative. If the person says something that seems to be irrelevant, our brains automatically look for a pragmatic meaning that will make the utterance relevant. and not just relevance. Paul Grice spelled out 4 ways that we cooperate to make for clear communication when we talk to each other. If someone violates any of these maxims, our first instinct is to determine if there's a way to interpret what is said so that it conforms to the maxims. So briefly, quantity, don't give too little information, don't give too much. Quality, don't lie, don't make assertions for which there's not evidence. Relevance, only say things that are relevant at that point in the conversation. Manner, try to be clear and unambiguous. So why would someone say something that is clearly not true? For example, violating the maxim of quality. Maybe they're being sarcastic, or maybe they're being polite or humorous or deceitful. And that deceitful is important, but we're not going to talk about it today. Let's go back to the sentence under discussion. Okay, we don't need you to do that. First, the literal meaning, the semantic meaning. Whether they need him to do that isn't very relevant, because since he didn't ask if they needed it. The pragmatic meaning is probably something else. What would be relevant is if the dispatcher were really telling him, don't do that. It was just dressed up in a more polite phrasing. It's the same thing if the police officer who stopped you says, will you get out of the car, please? That's not really a polite request that you have the option of declining. So, what was really meant? George Zimmerman himself can tell us. Now, this discussion that I've talked about continued on the political blogs for weeks, but then the issue was settled abruptly. Zimmerman had made a statement to the police the night of the shooting, but that statement was not released to the public for some time. And it included this. The dispatcher told me not to follow the suspect and that an officer was en route. So Zimmerman heard, we don't need you to do that, and interpreted it to mean, don't do that. He understood the pragmatic meaning right away, despite the semantic meaning that had been discussed on the political blogs. Now, the third trial is one that you probably have not heard about. It occurred in the Los Angeles area almost 15 years ago. I'm going to spend more time on this case, both because it has more complex issues and because I worked on it. Now, it's a sad story. A woman was watching her baby grandson while the baby's teenage brother was in school. Something happened and the baby had to be rushed to the hospital where he died. The grandmother was convicted of murdering the baby. Years later, the case was taken up by the Project for the Innocent, which is a nonprofit organization housed in the law school of the Loyola University in Los Angeles. They thought that the grandmother had been unjustly convicted. An important part of the prosecution's evidence was the daughter's testimony. She blamed her mother for the baby's death. The Project for the Innocent asked me to analyze the daughter's interview by 2 detectives. It was about 2 hours long, and the interview took place in the hospital where the baby was being treated. They wanted to know if what was in the interview supported what was said at the trial. So this is the case. And here are the people I'm going to talk about. Maria had a daughter, Raquel, who was 15 years old at the time. Raquel had a baby son named Emanuel. Maria was watching Emanuel at her house while Raquel was at school. She found the baby on the floor, not breathing, and rushed him to the hospital where he died later. Now, why did he die? These are 2 stories that were told in court. Maria killed him. She shook him or strangled him because she hated his father. Or his medical problems killed him. He had been sick for quite some time. In court, the prosecution's argument won out, and Maria was convicted of murdering her grandson. Years after her conviction, the Project for the Innocent tried to get her freed. They asked me to review a recording of a police interview. In the hospital, Two female detectives had interviewed Raquel for a couple of hours. Raquel ended up blaming her mother for the baby's death. Well, what happened in the hour and a half before she said that? What's the context? That would be important in evaluating what she said at the end of the interview. And this is what I mean by context. Sometimes in a criminal case, the police or the prosecutor will look through the record of a conversation and find a damning statement. Colloquially, a smoking gun. But the statement might not mean what it seems to mean when taken out of context. Now, the inverted pyramid structure here is not my invention. I copied it from the forensic linguist Roger Shy because that's a really good tool. What do these terms mean? Let's start at the top. The speech event is the overall situation in which the discourse will take place. In our case, it's a police interview. Schemas. That's the mental model for what is going on. Whatever schema you have in mind for the situation determines how you will interpret what's said. Things work best if everyone involved is working from the same schema. Agendas. What is each person trying to accomplish in the conversation? Speech acts. This is the way of categorizing some utterances. Speech acts are things like announcing, apologizing, claiming, or promising. Strategies. What did the participants do in order to get the conversation to go the way they want? Now, those last four, the ones in the circle. Sentences, phrases, words, and sounds. Those are the ones you are familiar with. And that low level is what an investigator might be looking for. But as I said, if you focus on looking for a smoking gun, you might interpret it incorrectly because you're ignoring the larger context. Now, let's look at the language evidence we have using this hierarchy as a guide. Here's the speech event, a police interview. Two female detectives are interviewing a teenage girl in a hospital. The girl's baby was taken to the hospital because of a medical emergency. When we consider speech events, one important question is whether there's a power imbalance. That will affect the discourse. If you have a casual conversation with your coworker, you might complain about the company or the department management. But if you're in your boss's office with the door closed, the conversation might be different. There's now a power imbalance. If you say the wrong thing, it can affect your pay or your situation at work. You could even lose your job. So consider this situation. The interview is in the hospital. There are a few different factors that make for a power imbalance. First is simply age. Young people, children and adolescents, have lower social status than adults do. They have fewer legal rights. They are often in the company of parents, teachers, or other authority figures. They're in the habit of being deferential to adults. And in this situation, the authority figures are police detectives, people with more legal power than even most adults. They have the power to arrest you. They might be carrying guns. Not to mention simply numbers. There are two detectives, and there's one girl with nobody to support her. The next level down from a speech event is the schema. How do each of the participants understand what's going on? How do they interpret what's said? Schemas are time savers. Suppose I tell you about when I went out to dinner last week. You'll immediately bring up the restaurant schema in your own head. The schema will include, for example, customers, waitresses or waiters, tables, and so forth. I don't have to explain these things to you because we are working from the same schema. If I refer to the waitress, you already know who that is and what her role is. But if I refer to the skateboarder, I'll have to explain how he got into the story because the restaurant schema doesn't include a skateboarder. So how will the participants interpret what's going on in the discourse? The two detectives have probably been briefed on what's happening, and doing interviews like these are part of her job. It's not the same for Raquel. She is probably not very familiar with police interviews, and the detectives don't tell her explicitly why they're there. So what is Raquel's schema? She gave it explicitly. And this is what she said when she was asked. They're saying that about the bruising that on my baby, and they want to know what happened, why he got like that. And then she talked about her starting to explain the baby's health issues from the previous day. And as it will become clear later, that's not what the detectives had in mind. But the detectives were not explicit about their schema. Now let's talk about agendas. This is more complex. Within their schemas, what were the participants trying to accomplish during the conversation? Someone might have more than one agenda, and their agendas might change over the course of the discourse. We can examine agendas in detail. We can start here. This is what the prosecutor in the trial said that Raquel's agenda in the interview was. She was trying to find out who killed her baby. Now, this is a puzzling statement because it can't be true. Apparently, the prosecutor did not read the transcript of the police interview, or at least not all of it. As far as Raquel knew, during the interview, her baby was still alive, being treated by the hospital doctors to save his life. Let me show you. The detectives are talking about Emanuel as if he's still alive. They said, your baby's in a house where he's, almost killed. How can we leave the baby in a house like that? They're talking about what will happen to Emanuel after he's released from the hospital. And they said, we need to know what happened, or else he's just going to lay there like a vegetable. They're talking about the medical outcome for Emanuel. Will he be healthy, or will he have serious mental problems? And incidentally, I think that he's going to lay there like a vegetable would be pretty upsetting for Raquel. The more you help us, the more we can help your baby. Clearly, the baby is still alive if he can be helped. And remember, at this time, the detectives are Raquel's only source of information about Emanuel's condition. Okay. The next level of detail on the pyramid is speech acts. So you remember when I talked about speech acts in relation to the George Zimmerman case? It was a series of questions and answers, but there will also be other speech acts as part of the back and forth, explaining and instructing, things like that. Let's talk about asking about questions. Here are some of the questions that Raquel asked. You want the number? She's offering information without being asked. The other questions are all asking for clarification. She wants to make sure she understands the question before she answers it. She's being cooperative. And again, with these questions, she is just trying to make sure that she gets the question right, so she can give the right answer. And that's all. These are all the questions that Raquel asked during the 2-hour interview. This gives us clues about her agenda, the step above on the pyramid. The agenda appears to be to give the detectives the information they want. She's being very cooperative. The schema she is working with is that the detectives need information from her to help her baby. And I think this limited set of questions is also a result of the power imbalance. The authority figures are asking the questions. The child is not. Let's go back to the inverted pyramid for a reminder. Raquel's schema is that this is an interview to gather information that will help her baby medically. Her only agenda, at least at the beginning, is to give the detectives the information they need. What about her strategies? Well, there's not much more to say. The detectives ask questions, she answers them. She is not otherwise trying to steer the conversation. Besides not asking real questions of her own, she also doesn't introduce any new topics. There were hundreds of questions asked, nearly all of them by the detectives. They were also the ones to introduce new topics. Was their schema different from Raquel? Did they understand the interview differently than she did? Yes. We can tell this by the types of questions they asked. They were not focusing on the events of the day or on health issues with the baby. They were not gathering information that would be of use to the doctors. They did ask questions about the timeline for the day. When Raquel went to school, when she got home, when her brother Samuel usually got home from school, things like that. But they also wanted to know about all the family members. Who drove Raquel to the hospital when she learned her baby was there? What sort of work does Raquel's sister do? How many people live in the house? Lots of things that are unrelated to the baby's breathing problems that sent him to the hospital. Then they moved into other areas. How did Raquel's mother feel about the baby's father? How did Maria treat the baby? How did everyone else treat the baby? In the interview, there were hundreds of questions asked. As I showed you before, Raquel asked only 10 of them, and those were only about clarifying the questions asked by the detectives. Now, about an hour into the interview, something new enters the discourse. The detectives start accusing Raquel or her mother of lying or of harming Emanuel. The accusations start kind of indirectly and then become more direct and forceful. Here are a few quotes. It looks to me like people aren't paying attention to that baby, implying that Raquel is a neglectful mother. You're busy. You don't have time for that baby, do you? Another suggestion that she isn't a good mother. Tell me the truth. In other words, you're lying to us. Somebody knows what happened, Raquel, and I think you know. In other words, you are keeping secrets from us. And remember, the story the detectives were telling her is that she needs to give them the information they need in order to save her baby. So the stakes are very high for Raquel and Emanuel. What strategies are the detectives using to support their agenda? One strategy was introducing new information, things Raquel didn't know or didn't think of on her own. Here are some examples. Did someone shake the baby to cause his injuries? Raquel didn't know that. Raquel didn't say that. How does Maria feel about the baby? Does your mom get tired of taking care of the baby? Maria's depressed. Raquel didn't say that. Maria resents having to watch the baby. Again, Raquel didn't say that. In fact, what she had been saying earlier in the interview was that Maria loved the baby and they got along well. Another important strategy was blocking. You remember that Raquel's agenda was to give the detectives the information they needed because they said it was necessary to keep her baby from dying or from turning into a vegetable. So she's trying to tell her story. Raquel can't tell them exactly what happened before Emanuel was taken to the hospital because she wasn't there. She was at school. She got some information from her mother and her brother, but she was not an eyewitness. The detectives would not let her tell that story. If she tried, they continually blocked her. They told her, don't go there, or they accused her of lying or of keeping secrets. Let's look at some examples. Raquel, what's going on here? What really happened? What happened this morning when you woke the baby up? This implies that Raquel had been lying about the events. Raquel says the baby is fine when she woke up early that morning. The detectives orders her, tell me the truth. The detective is accusing Raquel of holding back information and lying when she says she didn't know what happened because she wasn't there. Somebody knows what happened, Raquel, and I think you know. Come on. Again, accusing Raquel of lying and withholding information. Raquel says, I don't know what happened. The detective says, yes, you do. Now, this part is puzzling. Don't be selfish. The detective doesn't give any indication why saying that she only knows what her mother told her is being selfish or somehow harming Emanuel. And again, Raquel insists that she's telling the truth, and the detective accuses her of lying. And as you can tell from my notes, Raquel is crying now as the detectives browbeat her. Now, on this slide, I put a question mark in the title because I'm not sure when this became the detective's agenda. It may have been their goal all along. It appears to have been their agenda at least since after the first hour. They were not really interested in Emanuel's medical history or his health status the past day. At this point, and maybe earlier, they were looking for someone to blame. It appears that they wanted a suspect. They had suggested that Raquel may have mistreated the baby. Eventually, they began harping on how Maria had her own problems, and she was mean to the baby. Now, was this child abuse or murder? That depends on whether Emanuel is dead at this time. I suspect he was, but that was not part of the interview. Now, if Raquel doesn't confess, maybe she will blame her mother or her brother. You saw that in the transcript that Raquel was crying. She was powerless in this situation. The detectives, the super authority figures, would not allow her to tell the truth that she knew. She wasn't going to get out of that room unless she told a story that the detectives wanted to hear. So her new agenda is simply to try to deal with a situation that she sees as hopeless. She could only somehow agree with the detectives. Finally, we get to this point. What's your mother doing to your baby? Raquel says that she is hurting him. Now, I did not see all the evidence presented in court. I was brought in as an expert witness to examine some of the evidence. Specifically, I was asked to determine whether what the prosecutor said in court was supported by what transpired in this interview. I think there was probably another interaction between Raquel and the police in which she made some sort of formal statement, and that may be where she said more explicitly that her mother caused the injuries that sent Emanuel to the hospital. But let's talk about this particular statement, the bolded part. If you're a detective or a prosecutor, this is a useful piece of evidence. Raquel says that her mother hurt Emanuel. A prosecutor can point to this and similar statements as evidence that the defendant is guilty. How can the defendant's lawyer rebut that? Possibly by doing what I have done. This utterance came near the end of a 2-hour interview. A linguist can look at what was said in those 2 hours to see what that statement means in context. Based on what I've told you today, it seems fairly clear that Raquel's implication of her mother should not be taken at face value. The detectives essentially cornered her. They used conversational strategies that forced her to implicate her mother, or herself, or her brother. They would not accept the claim that she didn't know what happened, or that Emanuel's existing illness is what sent him to the hospital. I'll give you a moment to read this. So this is a useful quote. Young people are more susceptible to such manipulation. This was not strictly a false confession case, but I think the dynamics are the same. It's a false accusation of a loved one. Now, it took some time, but Maria was eventually freed. For this case, I did the long analysis of the police interview with Maria's daughter. I also did a less involved analysis of another witness's testimony. But I will say that my linguistic evidence was not the only evidence they presented, and probably not the most important. It would be rare for a suspect to be identified or a defendant to be convicted or acquitted based solely on linguistic evidence. The investigator or the lawyer would get evidence from other sources as well. So those are the 3 cases I wanted to talk about. I'll be happy to answer your questions. and you can email me if you want.
That's great, Joe. To me, this is all fascinating stuff. Thank you so much. And you know, those cases, you know, are all very interesting. Of course, we all watched both the Chauvin trial and the Zimmerman trial back a few years ago. And with the Chauvin trial, that was very interesting how you introduced forensic phonetics, how that could determine what he was saying, but also couldn't a forensic linguist present evidence, perhaps that in African American vernacular English, that people don't say I eat drugs or I ate drugs. Wouldn't that be one way also to?
Yeah, that was my second point regarding linguistics in that case. They could bring in the forensic phonetician to look at the spectrogram, but also if they brought in a dialectologist who knew about the dialect that George Floyd spoke, yes, they would know from research or from starting new research whether I ate too many drugs is a common thing to say. It's not a common thing in my experience, and somebody else would have to say whether that's likely in that other dialect.
Right. And also, people probably recall that the defense made a big point of when they interviewed George Floyd's girlfriend. They asked her, well, didn't he call you mama also? Because in the almost 10 minutes in which he was dying, he was calling for, oh, I'm here. So why would that be important if the defense is somehow trying to prove something that maybe he wasn't really calling for his mama, he was actually calling for his girlfriend while he was dying?
I don't think I followed the trial closely enough to offer any useful opinion on that part. Sorry.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's something to think about. Also on the George Zimmerman trial, you know, when you were explaining it, it does seem that George Zimmerman understood what the dispatcher was trying to tell him.
Yes.
And also the 911 call, if you listen to that, you could probably, people could venture an opinion, wouldn't you say? Because, you know, there's a difference between saying, oh, we don't really need you to do that, as opposed to something like, we don't need you to do that.
Yes. I was going just from the transcript. I don't recall if I went to the trouble of listening to the 911 call or not.
And Mike says that this reminds him of Henry II saying, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? Not an explicit order, but 4 knights departed immediately. So they knew what he meant. And there's
plausible
also,
deniability.
I think it's Hadar that says, you know, that English is, often we don't say exactly what we mean, correct? So that's why it's hard, and particularly female English, that we tend to say, would you mind doing that? Or we don't say, do it. So the other speakers of other languages are often confused if there's not an explicit command. Is that correct?
Yeah, I doubt that is limited to English, but if you're coming from another language, you're probably very used to that in that other language. And may not even notice it because you're swimming that sea already. But when you try to learn English, you got to deal with idioms. You have to deal with pragmatic implications, things like that.
So I have to apologize. It keeps coming on and off. But we have
Okay.
some other questions.
Yes.
Hadar also wants to know, let me find it again. Oh, he says, he once judged a really interesting NSF proposal to apply forensic linguistics to Miranda warnings for juveniles. The researchers argued that juveniles could not understand the warnings in the traditional way that they were administered. How do you think we should craft Miranda warnings to make sure that suspects in custody understand them?
You know, that could be the topic for another talk entirely.
Okay.
Miranda warnings and similar police cautions, as they're called in other countries, do get a lot of scrutiny from forensic linguists. The Miranda warning, which is used in the US, it needs to be simplified. It's got a lot of embedded clauses and phrases. It puts a lot of cognitive burden on the listener to make sense of this, with this, you know, just the clause and phrases. It's a lot of effort. It is not easy for people who don't have English for a second language to understand. It's even kind of hard for people who have English as a first language to keep straight. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I could, if you want to have me back and talk about Miranda warnings.
Okay, that would be great. Okay, Betty wants to know if you recall what the additional medical evidence was in the Maria Mendez trial and why it wasn't presented in the first place.
I don't know why it was not presented in the first place, but when they went back for the, I think it was some step after appeals to get her freed, there was new evidence that the shaking hypothesis did not hold up when they looked at, I believe it was X-rays. I'd have to go back to my notes and to news. You can probably find that in news reports from back about maybe 3 years ago when she was released.
Okay.
I know, yeah. If you want to research, it was in.
Joyce would like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done. Go ahead.
Okay. Joyce wants to know if Pratt identifies who the speaker is on a recording when they're doing the
No, does not identify the speaker necessarily. There was several years ago a lot of discussion about voice prints. Voice prints have been debunked. They don't work. There's just too much variability. Your voice print is going to be different if you're shouting or if you're whispering, or depending on the acoustics of where you are. But forensic phonetics, and again, I'll say I'm not an expert on phonetics. I know something about it, but they can tell, as I explained in the talk, they can tell what sounds are being produced. They can also tell to some extent whether it's from a larger person or a smaller person, which sort of correlates with between men and women, things like that. That's I have heard about these things, but can't talk in detail.
Okay.
No, doesn't necessarily identify an individual. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, the interview with Raquel, you know, it seems to me that that part that you highlighted, she was given a hypothetical situation, wasn't she? That she was kind of told, well, if somebody hurt her, who would it have been? You know, and how would they have hurt him, right? So, you know, she was so conned into saying something, and Lindy wants to know what we should do if we're in a situation like Raquel is in. You know, should we, you know, say pause the interrogation because Raquel seemed to just want to go and find out how her baby was doing and was not
Yes.
comfortable being there.
Yeah. I would say you should ask a lawyer about that. My general advice is don't talk to the police about without a lawyer. But I'm the wrong. I don't have the expertise to go beyond that.
Okay. And then Gwen is asking, she said that when the daughter said her mother hurt the baby, she was referring to allowing a rash. So was part of your job also to point out where it seems prosecution or defense was taking the statements out of context, as in hurting simply referring to allowing a rash to develop?
Yeah, that would be neglect. Yeah, apparently the baby had quite a case of diaper rash. Yes, that's the sort of thing I might put in my report when I was done. Don't remember if I
And Sue
addressed it in this one.
also, Sue wants to know why there would be emphasis on whether George Floyd said, "I ate drugs" or "I ain't do drugs," because Derek Chauvin was the one who had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and who ultimately killed him. So why does that become important in a trial?
It became important in this trial because what the defense was trying to do was find reasons why Chauvin's actions were not or not entirely responsible for George Floyd's death. And the idea they were trying to get across to the jury was that George Floyd had taken some sort of drugs, maybe an overdose. I ate too many drugs, and that would have given him breathing problems.
Right.
So
yeah.
that would be a legal strategy.
And Mike points out that it would seem really unlikely that George Floyd would say, "I ate too much drugs," while someone is kneeling on him. So that might be something to consider too.
Yes.
Joyce also points out that 911 started out by saying, "Okay, we don't need you to do that." So it's almost that could be taken as an agreement of Zimmerman following, then further response makes it optional. I don't know.
I would not interpret it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, just like you said, okay, right then. Okay is a discourse marker. It signals something. In that context, I would say, starting out by saying okay is indicating something like, I hear you say that, let me say something else.
And David says that not a question, but that Jenny, who's been a certified court reporter here in Washington State for more than 3 decades, is with him and was a member of the first cohort of certified court interpreters in Washington State in 1999. Although Jenny's training and experience has not incorporated some of the formal linguistic modeling, she has dealt with so many of these issues over the years in legal interpreting and legal translation. Separately, we think that Joe mentioned that the convicted defendant was a Spanish speaker. We're wondering whether there were any issues in this case coming from the defendant's limited English proficiency.
She did have a court interpreter while she was in court. And the other issue that I addressed as part of the analyzing testimony was, this might take a minute to explain. She was overheard, Maria was overheard to say when she got the news about Emanuel, the witness said, she said, mea culpa, which the lawyers and the prosecutor said, well, she was confessing to God that she had killed the baby, which is not what was happening. Almost certainly, and I put a lot of qualifiers in my report about this, but almost certainly she was using the Spanish ethnic culpa, which is very similar, but it's like when someone commits suicide or something happens to somebody, oh, it's my fault. If I had talked to him last night, he wouldn't have done this, that sort of thing. It was that sort of expression, not a confession to God that she had committed a sin or committed a murder. So yes, there was that issue, that language issue I addressed. Beyond that, I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a terrible situation because she found the baby unconscious, and of course you feel guilty about that, whether you did anything or not. That
Oh,
maybe
if I had been in the room,
a minute earlier.
Perfect. Exactly.
So but these are all just fascinating cases, and your work is fascinating, and I hope that it continues to be so, and that you come back and talk to us all about Miranda warnings, because I know that's a whole big topic on its own. So thank you so much, Joe, and I'm sure that we've all had a lot to think about, and I appreciate all of you coming today. So long. Bye, Joe.
I'm glad to do
it.
Okay, bye-bye.